And the results were the best-selling bossa nova album of all time. An album that won Album of the Year at the Grammys, which forever changed what working musicians would play at gigs. An album that was simply entitled Gets Gilberto. Hi, my name is Stockton Helbing, and I play the drums. Jazz music is often thought of as an amalgamation of African culture and European musical culture that blended in the United States through the atrocities of the slave trade in the 1700s and 1800s. But what is often overlooked, yet is very important to the history of jazz, are the influences of other cultures, such as South America. The Brazilian culture had a massive impact on jazz starting in the 1960s and forever changed certain aspects of jazz music and particularly impacted what working jazz musicians are going to find themselves playing at any cocktail hour or wedding throughout their gigging career. Tenor saxophonist Stan Getz was achieving some of his greatest notoriety in the early 1960s. Getz, whose nickname was The Sound, achieved that nickname for the smooth tone he had, which he modeled after his hero, tenor saxophonist Lester Young. As tenor saxophonist icon John Coltrane is famous for saying, "We would all sound like Stan Getz if we could." Well, in the early 1960s, when Getz is starting to enjoy his notoriety and his fame, it's not for playing some of his more cherished bebop music, but rather for playing a new style of music that was becoming more and more popular in the United States, particularly amongst young college people. It was the bossa nova, a style of music brought to the United States from Brazil. So in 1964, after making a couple of jazz Latin albums such as Jazz Samba, Getz was asked by producer Creed Taylor to record an album with Brazilian composer, pianist, and guitarist Antonio Carlos Jobim and guitarist João Gilberto. And the results were the best-selling bossa nova album of all time. An album that won Album of the Year at the Grammys, which forever changed what working musicians would play at gigs. An album that was simply entitled Gets Gilberto. So why was this album, Gets and Gilberto, such a game changer? Why was it so popular? Why did it win all the accolades that it won? Why does every one of your grandparents have a copy of this record and a stack of records at home? Well, it's for a couple easy reasons. People who were not fans of jazz could find it very soothing and relaxing simply because of the dynamic and style and texture of the music. This album, first of all, brought with it a very understated sound, a very soft sound. As a matter of fact, when you're listening to it, it's astounding how soft all of the instrumentalists are playing. You can hear that Stan Getz himself is at times struggling just to make a tone because he's blowing so lightly. You can hear the keys on his saxophone clicking shut because every musician is playing so softly. And this iconic sound of bossa nova has become nearly destroyed in our culture today because if you go into any elevator or any public department store, you'll hear a bossa nova playing over the speakers above because it's thought to be a soothing style of music. But I find that most people have really missed how sensitive it truly is. When we listen to this album, we feel at ease because it forces us to be quiet. It forces our mind to be quiet, to appreciate it. And when these musicians are playing together in this style, this bossa nova style, they're using fairly complicated rhythms. You hear often the drummer, the guitarist, and the pianist playing different cross-current polyrhythms, but it all works to form a beautiful groove because they are being dynamically sensitive to each other and listening to each other so that they make sure they're working in conjunction with the other rhythms each player are playing. One of the things that made this album so unique is the personnel on it. We have Stan Getz, a perennial jazz musician known for being a great bebop musician since he became famous and known for soloing with Woody Herman's big band in the 40s and through being an early pioneer of bebop in the late 40s, early 50s. but every other musician on this album is Brazilian. I find it particularly interesting there actually are not any African American musicians on this. Something that all great jazz albums usually have is predominantly African American musicians. Well, here we have one of our most classic jazz albums ever recorded that features primarily Brazilian musicians. And they forever changed the blueprint of what's possible in jazz music. As a matter of fact, other famous jazz musicians start emulating what they hear. One of my favorite reactions to this album is on Joe Henderson's first recording, Page 1, where his good friend, trumpet player Kenny Dorham, wrote a great bossa nova entitled Blue Bossa, which to me is a sarcastic reaction, where bossa nova is smooth and legato. Kenny Dorham writes sarcastically short melody notes and a very busy bass line. But everyone had to come to terms with the beautiful music that was created on this album, especially jazz musicians coast to coast. So with any well-known jazz album that has wonderful awards given to it, has a lot of album sales, it becomes hugely influential on musicians everywhere in the United States, and especially the jobbing musician, the musician who's playing gigs, cocktail parties, corporate events, weddings. Well, a bossa nova is standard fare for any professional musician, especially you professional drummers out there or desiring professional drummers. You're going to play bossa novas. Well, the popularity of bossa nova comes from this album, and it all comes from the way the drums are played on this recording. The way the drummer, whose name is Milton Banana, it's not his real name, that's his stage name, the way he plays, whether it be the way he uses brushes, the way he plays with sticks, all of it boils down to sensitivity. And it's the number one thing that I find young drummers have trouble with, is having the dynamic, sensitive control to play the style appropriately. Everyone thinks that a bossa nova is a two-measure repeated phrase over and over and over. But it's quite the contrary. There's do's and don'ts, tendencies of things you want to do, and we can start developing those things by listening to and playing along with this beautiful album, Gets Gilberto. And so many marquee songs come from this album, the most famous being The Girl from Ipanema. Anybody who's ever played a gig has played The Girl from Ipanema, and most people play it horribly bad. Most people have never heard the original. As a matter of fact, I was one of those people who played Girl from Ipanema for years and quite frankly did not enjoy it because I didn't understand what my goal was. We would never leave for a trip without knowing our destination, and we should never play a song without knowing what the original version sounds like. How do we know what to do? When I started listening to this album many years ago as a young drummer and I heard the sounds on the record, I was quite frankly ashamed of the way I had played this song in the past. And I decided that I wanted to make sure I did it justice, the same way I would if I listened to a classic Miles Davis album featuring Philly Joe Jones on drums, or a famous John Coltrane album featuring Elvin Jones on drums. I knew exactly the way I wanted to play. I knew the target I was emulating. I didn't have that in my mind when I was playing bossa novas, especially if I was playing The Girl from Ipanema or Corcovado, the other marquee known tune from this recording. So in particular, those two songs are songs that any young musician desiring to have a career in jazz need to become familiar with. There's a lot of interesting facts that tie into the creation of this album, whether it be how softly it was recorded, whether it be the really excellent production by Creed Taylor, the producer, or another famous producer who wasn't famous yet was engineering, Phil Ramone, who was particularly known for capturing great sounds. One of my favorite aspects of Phil Ramone is he was known for actually walking out of the control room into the main room where the musicians were to hear their sound to ensure he was capturing it correctly in the control room. Or one of the more, let's say, saucy aspects of this recording is that the guitarist, João Gilberto, his wife, Astrude, sings The Girl from Ipanema and Corcovado. At the time, Astrude was not a well-known singer. She actually was considered just an amateur vocalist. But The Girl from Ipanema became such a huge hit, she was catapulted into stardom. And it wasn't too many years after this that she ended up getting a divorce from her husband and starting a long-term affair with Stan Getz. Though he never finalized his divorce, they were together for many years. And to me, it adds to the mysteriousness of me listening to this recording. There's a certain sensual sound that I hear, particularly when you go listen to Getz playing behind Astrude singing these lyrics. You have to think that there's some of that love at first sight going on, and that both of them perhaps were inspired when performing this music live, and it adds to that sultry nature of the song, which pairs very nicely with this very delicate, soft, and provocative sound of the bossa nova on this album. So these are sounds that are really excellent to become familiar with, so that when you play them in groups yourself, you know what you're hearkening back to. It's not that you have to become an echo of that, but rather you want to be well informed from the past so that it unlocks your creative future. And you can hear so many different artists who have gone on to take the sensibilities, the sensitive dynamic range, the sparseness, the simplicity of melodic presentation, taking those key characteristics from this bossa nova style and applied them to a lot of other types of styles in both the jazz vernacular and abroad. It's not just jazz musicians who were influenced by this album, Getz and Gilberto, but all kinds of musicians in all other popular types of musical fields. If you have enjoyed hearing about this album today and you want to learn more about it, I have one great piece of advice for you. You should listen to it. The greatest way to learn more about an album is to listen to that album. And notice that I use the word album. To study jazz music thoroughly and correctly, you want to study it by album. These albums were made to be one complete piece of art. So get the recording of the original album, sit down, close your eyes, and have a wonderful educational experience. And after you've listened to it a couple times, get your instrument out, sit down, and try to play along with it. And do that until you like what you hear. And I guarantee you, you will continue to have fun and joy playing jazz music.